What if the most dangerous thing in your mind isn't ignorance, but structure? Not the lack of understanding, but the overwhelming presence of systems designed to help you understand. Because there is a moment in every thinking mind where clarity stops being liberation and starts becoming a cage. Why does this happen? Because the human brain doesn't want truth, it wants order. It builds something like a mental story_map, not to discover reality, but to survive its complexity. A structure that says, this means this, that leads to that. Everything has its place. But here's the contradiction that breaks most people without them noticing. The more detailed your map becomes, the less you actually experience the territory. And this is where the illusion begins. In Buddhist philosophy, this is not new. It is the moment where the finger pointing at the moon becomes more important than the moon itself. A symbolic inversion where guidance turns into attachment, where clarity becomes identity, where systems become self. And once that happens, you are no longer observing reality. You are observing your interpretation of reality. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. If your understanding of the world depends entirely on your internal maps, how do you know you are still seeing the world at all? Or are you just seeing your own architecture reflected back at you? This is not theoretical. This is psychological structure. Because every modern mind today is surrounded by layers of story_map systems, productivity frameworks, learning models, cognitive systems, content strategies, even spiritual interpretations. Each one promises the same thing: control the chaos. But control always comes at a cost. And the cost is subtle at first. You stop reacting to life directly. You start reacting to your interpretation of life. You stop feeling uncertainty. You start labeling uncertainty. You stop seeing problems. You start placing problems into predefined categories so they feel manageable. And slowly, without noticing, your mind shifts from living inside reality to living inside a model of reality. There is a memory fragment buried in this shift. The map replaces the territory. It sounds abstract, but its consequence is extremely real. People begin optimizing their thoughts instead of experiencing them. They organize their emotions instead of feeling them. They analyze meaning instead of encountering it. Another fragment emerges. Too many systems don't create clarity. They create distance. Distance from intuition. Distance from immediacy. Distance from the raw uncertainty that actually makes perception alive. And here is where the consequence escalates. The more refined your story_map becomes, the more confident you feel in explaining the world, and the less capable you become of encountering it without explanation. So what does this mean spiritually? It suggests something deeper, that understanding itself can become a form of attachment, a subtle grip on reality disguised as intelligence. And this is where the paradox sharpens. Because if every map is a distortion, then even this explanation is a distortion too. Which raises a more dangerous question. If every attempt to structure reality pulls you further away from reality, then what happens when your entire identity is built on structuring it? And suddenly, the foundation shifts. Because the real issue is not whether story_maps are useful. The real issue is whether you are still aware that you are inside one, or whether the map has already become the only world you recognize. And if that is true, then the question is no longer about how accurate your understanding is. The question becomes, who are you when the map disappears? Then the real question isn't whether your map is accurate. It's whether your mind is already dependent on having one at all. Because once a story_map becomes your default way of thinking, something subtle happens. You stop encountering uncertainty as uncertainty. You convert it immediately into structure. But here is where the core conflict deepens. Reality does not actually behave in structured layers. It flows, collapses, contradicts itself, reappears in new forms. And yet the mind insists on forcing it into stable categories. Why? Because human psychology is built on survival through simplification. The brain prefers reduced models over raw complexity. It prefers explanation over ambiguity, even when that explanation is incomplete or even false. And this is where the illusion becomes powerful. You begin to trust your internal system more than what is actually happening. There is a memory fragment here. The mind prefers a wrong map over no map at all. It sounds simple, but it explains why people cling to belief systems, productivity frameworks, identity narratives, even when those systems no longer match their lived experience. And if we extend this into symbolic language, the story_map becomes more than a tool. It becomes a psychological artifact of control, a way to stabilize reality so the self does not dissolve under uncertainty. But in Buddhist philosophy, this stabilization is already the beginning of suffering, because what you are stabilizing is not reality. It is attachment to interpretation. So let me ask you something sharper. If your mind constantly converts experience into structure, what part of you is actually left to experience anything directly? This is where the perspective shifts. Because in earlier stages, we thought the map was just a tool. But now we see something more uncomfortable. The map begins to define the observer. Your preferences, your fears, even your sense of identity become organized around systems of understanding. Another memory fragment appears. You don't just use systems, you start becoming the system you use. And this is where modern life intensifies the pattern. Today, everything is a story_map. Your goals are mapped. Your habits are mapped. Your productivity is mapped. Even your emotions are categorized into frameworks of optimization. Social media turns identity into a structured narrative you manage daily. But what happens when everything is structured? A scale shift emerges here, from individual cognition to collective consciousness. Entire societies begin to think in frameworks instead of presence. We don't just understand life, we diagram it, categorize it, and optimize it. And yet something essential is lost in this transformation. Direct perception, not interpretation, not analysis, not explanation, just raw, unfiltered awareness of what is happening before it becomes a system. Here lies the contradiction. The more intelligent the structure, the more distant the experience. And this leads to a deeper revelation. The story_map is not just a reflection of intelligence. It is a defense mechanism against existential instability. A way to prevent the mind from confronting the possibility that not everything can be explained. But that defense creates its own consequence. You begin to fear situations that cannot be mapped. You avoid ambiguity. You feel discomfort when things don't fit categories. You unconsciously seek structure even in emotional chaos. And over time, your tolerance for unstructured reality weakens. Another memory fragment surfaces. What you cannot map, you eventually begin to fear. This is where the psychological loop becomes self-reinforcing. The more you rely on structure, the less capable you become without it. And the less capable you become, the more you rely on it. So the question is no longer about knowledge. It is about dependency. And this brings us closer to the symbolic center of the system. If every attempt to understand reality strengthens your reliance on interpretation, then what exactly is being liberated and what is being imprisoned? Because the most unsettling possibility is this. What if the story_map was never designed to reveal reality, but to replace your need to experience it directly? And if that is true, then the mystery expands again. When every layer of existence becomes explainable, what part of existence remains intentionally unexplainable? And why does your mind keep circling back to it anyway? Then something begins to fracture inside the system of understanding itself. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in a way that feels almost logical at first, like each step is justified, each layer of interpretation making more sense than the last. So the question becomes unavoidable. If structure is supposed to bring clarity, why does it start producing tension instead of peace? Because now the story_map is no longer passive. It is active. It begins to filter what you can even notice in the first place. You no longer see reality and then interpret it. You see only what your structure allows you to see. This is where the core conflict escalates beyond thought and into identity. What if the map is not just describing your mind, but reshaping what your mind is capable of perceiving? In psychological terms, this is where cognition stops being neutral. The system becomes self-reinforcing. You don't just use frameworks anymore, you defend them. You optimize within them. You interpret contradictions as exceptions instead of signals that the structure itself may be incomplete. A memory fragment surfaces here. A system that explains everything eventually explains away everything that does not fit. And once that happens, something subtle disappears, your tolerance for the unknown. But here is the contradiction that breaks the illusion further. The more complete your story_map becomes, the more it begins to generate areas it cannot fully integrate. Gaps appear. Inconsistencies emerge. Not because reality changed, but because reality was never designed to be fully contained in the first place. And yet the mind refuses to abandon the structure. Instead, it escalates. More layers, more categories, more refinement, until the map becomes so dense that it stops pointing outward and starts pointing only to itself. This is where symbolic meaning deepens into something heavier. In Buddhist philosophy, this is the moment where illusion becomes self-sustaining. Not because it is false in a simple sense, but because attachment to interpretation transforms perception into repetition. The mind is no longer observing impermanence, it is trying to systematize it. Another memory fragment emerges. When understanding becomes attachment, clarity turns into confinement. And now the scale shift becomes unavoidable. This is no longer about individual thinking. It expands into collective cognition. Entire environments, education, technology, content ecosystems, begin to reward structured interpretation over direct perception. Everything must be explained, categorized, optimized, and mapped. Even uncertainty is packaged into frameworks. Even confusion becomes a model. But what happens when every layer of reality is already pre-processed into meaning before you experience it? The consequence is not confusion. It is distance. A growing separation between lived experience and interpreted experience. And here the shadow function of story_map reveals itself fully. It does not just organize thought. It protects the mind from raw exposure to reality. It reduces emotional volatility. It reduces existential unpredictability. But in doing so, it also reduces immediacy. You no longer meet reality directly. You meet your interpretation of it through layers of cognitive insulation. And this is where escalation turns inward. Because once the mind adapts to structured perception, unstructured reality begins to feel unsafe. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Ambiguity becomes tension. The unknown becomes something to solve rather than something to experience. A third memory fragment appears. What you cannot categorize, you eventually begin to resist. And now the psychological loop tightens. The system creates dependence not through control, but through familiarity. The more structured your understanding becomes, the more disoriented you feel outside of it. So you return to the structure, not because it is complete, but because it is predictable. Yet the deeper contradiction remains unresolved. If story_map is supposed to bring you closer to understanding reality, why does it simultaneously increase your dependence on interpretation over perception? This is where revelation begins to surface, but remains incomplete. Because something fundamental is being hinted at but not yet fully exposed. The possibility that every layer of structure is not bringing you closer to truth, but further into a stabilized illusion that feels like truth. And if that is the case, then the real question is no longer about how accurate your map is. It is about what you lose every time you rely on it to see instead of seeing directly. But the answer is still missing. And that missing piece changes everything. Then the question shifts in a way that feels irreversible. Not because new information appears, but because the structure you trusted to interpret information starts to collapse under its own weight. So what is actually happening beneath all of this? The revelation is not that. The mind uses story_maps. The revelation is that the mind becomes them. At first, these systems feel like external tools, ways to organize complexity, reduce uncertainty, and create clarity. But over time, something subtle rewires perception itself. You stop applying structure to experience. You start experiencing through structure. And that difference is everything. Because once perception is filtered by systems before awareness even forms, you are no longer meeting reality directly. You are meeting pre-organized meaning. A memory fragment surfaces here. You do not see the world as it is. You see the world as your structure allows it to be seen. And that is the turning point. Because what was once a tool for understanding becomes a boundary for perception. This is where the deeper layer of the archetype reveals itself. Story_map is not just organization. It is substitution. It quietly replaces raw experience with interpreted experience so seamlessly that the transition feels like intelligence. But here is the deeper insight that destabilizes everything. The mind does not fear chaos because chaos is dangerous. It fears chaos because chaos cannot be immediately structured. And anything that cannot be structured threatens the identity built on structure. So the system expands. More frameworks, more categorization, more internal mapping, until even contradictions are absorbed into the model as exceptions rather than signals of limitation. Another memory fragment emerges. A perfect system is not one that explains everything. It is one that hides what it cannot explain. Now the consequence becomes visible at scale. In modern cognitive environments, this dynamic is amplified. Every domain, education, technology, spirituality, productivity, encourages structured interpretation as the highest form of understanding. You are rewarded not for seeing clearly, but for explaining efficiently. And over time, explanation replaces perception. This is not just psychological. It becomes existential. Because when everything must pass through a story_map before it is understood, direct experience becomes increasingly rare. Moments are no longer lived. They are processed. And something essential begins to fade. Presence. A third memory fragment appears. When everything is explained, nothing is truly encountered. Now the scale shift deepens. This is no longer about individual cognition. It becomes a civilization-level pattern. A collective preference for structured meaning over unfiltered reality. A world where even mystery is packaged into frameworks, and uncertainty is treated as a problem to eliminate rather than a state to experience. But here is the contradiction that emerges inside the revelation itself. The more complete the structure becomes, the more it depends on what lies outside it to remain meaningful. Without the unknown, the map loses purpose. Without chaos, order becomes hollow. Without direct experience, interpretation becomes empty repetition. And yet the system continues to expand. Because it cannot recognize that what it is trying to eliminate is also what gives it life. A final memory fragment surfaces. A map that covers everything eventually covers the need to live. And this is where the spiritual dimension becomes unavoidable. In Buddhist philosophy, this reflects a subtle inversion. The attachment to understanding becomes a form of ignorance itself. Not because understanding is wrong, but because clinging to it replaces immediacy with abstraction. So the revelation deepens, but does not complete itself. Because now a more unsettling question emerges beneath it. If story_maps are not just tools you use, but systems you unconsciously inhabit, then what part of your awareness is still untouched by structure? And if there is such a part, why does the mind resist it the most, even when it is the only thing that cannot be mapped? Then the final layer begins to surface, not as a new idea, but as a recognition that changes how everything before it must be understood. If the mind becomes its story_map, then what exactly is the part of you that believes it is using the map? This is where the core revelation collapses illusion into structure itself. The truth is not that story_maps distort reality. The truth is that they determine what counts as reality in the first place. And this is the hidden architecture. Underneath all cognition, the mind does not first perceive and then interpret. It constructs perception through interpretive frameworks so quickly that the separation no longer exists in experience. At that point, the map is no longer representing the territory. It is filtering which parts of the territory are allowed to exist in awareness. A memory fragment emerges. What is not structured cannot be seen. What is not seen cannot be known. What is not known becomes irrelevant. And that is the silent mechanism. This is the archetype beneath it all, not intelligence, but selective visibility. A controlled narrowing of infinite reality into manageable perception. Now the deeper consequence becomes unavoidable. Because if your awareness is always pre-shaped by systems of interpretation, then freedom is not about escaping reality. It is about recognizing the filter itself. But here is where the insight expands further. The story_map is not an enemy. It is not a mistake. It is a function of survival, designed to reduce infinite uncertainty into actionable meaning. The problem is not its existence. The problem is unconscious dependence on it. Another memory fragment appears. A tool becomes a prison when the user forgets it is optional. And now the psychological structure becomes clear. Desire drives the creation of maps. Attachment preserves them. Illusion emerges when they are mistaken for reality itself. and suffering begins when reality refuses to stay inside them. This is not abstract philosophy. It is observable in modern cognition at scale. People do not just think through frameworks, they defend them as identity. Ideas are no longer tools for exploration. They become territories to protect. Meaning becomes ownership. Understanding becomes attachment. And once that happens, transformation becomes difficult, because transformation requires the willingness to lose the structure that defines you. A third memory fragment surfaces. You cannot update a map you are emotionally attached to preserving. Now the scale shift expands again. Entire systems, education, media, technology, reward structured certainty over direct ambiguity. The result is a civilization, increasingly fluent in explanation, but less fluent in presence. Everything becomes readable. Everything becomes classifiable. Everything becomes reducible. But reality itself does not reduce. And that gap is where tension lives. This is where Buddhist philosophy reveals its deepest alignment with the problem. The attachment is not to things, but to interpretations of things. Not to experience, but to meaning constructed after experience. The shadow function of story_map is not confusion. It is substitution. It replaces direct engagement with stabilized meaning. And that substitution creates a paradox. The more stable your internal world becomes, the less responsive you are to the actual world. Because responsiveness requires uncertainty, and uncertainty requires the absence of total structure. But modern cognition often interprets uncertainty as failure rather than as openness. So the system closes. And what closes is not knowledge, but perception itself. Now the core revelation stabilizes into clarity. Story_maps are not just systems of understanding. They are boundaries of perception that define what reality is allowed to feel like. A final memory fragment appears. To see without a map is not confusion, it is exposure. And that is where the true tension lies. Because once you recognize the filter, you cannot return to innocence. But you also cannot fully abandon structure without losing orientation. So the unresolved question becomes heavier than before. If every act of understanding simultaneously reveals and restricts reality, then what does it mean to truly see anything at all, beyond the structure that makes seeing possible? Then what remains after the system has fully absorbed perception itself is not clarity, but consequence. Because once story_maps stop being tools and become the structure of awareness, the mind no longer simply interprets reality. It inherits the limits of its own interpretation. And the consequence is not immediate collapse. It is gradual narrowing. First, at the individual level, perception becomes less direct and more mediated. Experiences are no longer encountered as raw events, but as categorized signals. A feeling is no longer a feeling, it is a data point. A decision is no longer a moment of awareness. It is a node in a framework. This is where psychological function begins to shift into dependency. A memory fragment resurfaces here. What is not structured cannot be seen. What is not seen begins to disappear from experience. At the group level, this effect compounds. Shared story_maps begin to define what is considered valid perception. People no longer debate reality. They debate models of reality. The map becomes the common language of truth, even when it no longer reflects lived experience. And this is where the shadow function expands. Because once interpretation becomes collective, deviation feels like error. Direct perception feels like instability. And ambiguity feels like threat. So systems evolve to eliminate ambiguity faster than they understand it. At the systemic level, this creates a civilization optimized for explanation, not encounter. Everything must be translated into frameworks before it can be acknowledged. Everything must be understood before it can be experienced. Another memory fragment emerges. A system that cannot tolerate ambiguity will eventually mistake control for understanding. And here the legacy begins to take shape. The story_map does not disappear. It evolves into infrastructure. It becomes embedded in how knowledge is taught, how information is processed, how identity is formed. It becomes invisible precisely because it is everywhere. But invisibility does not mean neutrality. It means acceptance without awareness. And this is where spiritual consequence deepens. Because in Buddhist philosophy, attachment is not only emotional, it is structural. The attachment to interpretation becomes a form of subtle identity construction. You are no longer simply a person experiencing life. You are a system maintaining coherence between internal models and external input. And coherence becomes more important than truth. A third memory fragment surfaces. When coherence becomes more important than reality, perception begins serving structure instead of life. Now the scale shift expands beyond individuals and societies into civilization itself. Modern environments increasingly reward those who can navigate systems rather than those who can perceive directly. Success becomes tied to fluency in frameworks. Intelligence becomes measured by adaptability to models. Even creativity is filtered through structured expectations. But something is lost in this optimization. Direct contact with uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that does not resolve into categories. The kind that cannot be reduced into steps. The kind that exists before interpretation begins. And without that contact, experience becomes progressively abstracted from itself. This is not failure. It is evolution with a blind spot. Because every system that increases clarity also increases distance from what is unstructured. And what is unstructured is often what is most alive. A memory fragment echoes here. The more perfectly reality is organized, the less it feels like reality. At the deepest layer, this creates a paradox that cannot be resolved within the system itself. If story_maps are necessary for navigation, but also responsible for distancing perception from immediacy, then the very tool used to understand existence becomes what reshapes the experience of existence. And the legacy of that paradox is still unfolding, not as collapse, but as quiet transformation of how awareness relates to itself. Even now, the mind continues to refine its structures, unaware that refinement itself is reinforcing the separation between experience and interpretation. And so the consequence is not that reality becomes inaccessible. It is that reality becomes increasingly mediated until mediation feels identical to reality itself. A final memory fragment surfaces. When every experience must pass through interpretation, interpretation becomes indistinguishable from life. And now the reflection settles into something heavier. Because if this is true, then the question is no longer about whether the map is accurate. The question becomes whether awareness can still recognize anything before it becomes a map. And if it cannot, then what exactly is still looking through the system? In the end, nothing is truly resolved in the way the mind originally expects. Because what began as a search for understanding slowly transforms into something far more intimate. The recognition of how understanding itself shapes the one who seeks it. And in that recognition, something softens. Not a conclusion, but a shift in relationship. The final insight is not that story_maps are false, or even that they are limiting. It is that they are inseparable from the way awareness organizes itself in order to experience anything at all. They are not external constructions placed upon reality. They are the texture through which reality becomes readable in the first place. And yet, the cost of this readability is subtle separation. A final memory fragment rises. Every structure that brings clarity also draws a quiet line between seeing and being. This is the legacy of the archetype, not as a mistake and not as a villain, but as a necessary tension inside human cognition. The constant attempt to stabilize what cannot be fully stabilized, to define what resists definition, to hold still what only exists in movement. And perhaps this is where the deeper human meaning reveals itself. Because every mind that builds systems is not only trying to understand the world, it is trying to survive the overwhelming openness of reality itself. The desire for structure is not intellectual alone. It is emotional, existential, a way to make the infinite feel temporarily inhabitable. But in doing so, something essential is always at risk of being filtered out: immediacy, the raw contact with existence before it becomes explanation. A final memory fragment echoes through the entire journey. To understand everything is to risk no longer encountering anything. From a spiritual perspective, this is not a failure of intelligence. It is the natural consequence of consciousness attempting to stabilize itself inside its own reflections. The mind builds mirrors, then begins to mistake the reflections for the world they came from. And yet, even this realization does not offer escape. Because the act of recognizing the map does not remove the map. It only changes the way it is seen, and that change is irreversible. So the final reflection is not about abandoning understanding. It is about seeing the boundary between understanding and existence without confusing one for the other. A quiet return to something simpler, but not easier. The awareness that every interpretation is a bridge, but no bridge is the destination. And so the question that remains is not meant to be answered. It is meant to stay open, like an empty space the mind cannot fully structure, no matter how many story_maps it creates. If every attempt to understand reality becomes part of the structure that interprets it, then what, if anything, is ever experienced before interpretation begins? And who, exactly, is the one quietly noticing that gap?